Good morning, everyone. This is Candidate Master Isaac Steincamp from the Chess Summit Network. That's right. I finally earned my Candidate Master title. I found out last night that I finally picked up my 5th norm at the Pan American Intercollegiate Chess Championships. It was my 5th norm, and it took me about a year and 10 months to put together the title, and I'm really excited to really try to get the National Master title. I'm only 83 points away, and I have a tournament in Boston this weekend and a tournament in Philly next weekend where I can hope to reduce that gap. So I'm really excited, and for today's video, I wanted to share my round 3 game from the Pan American Intercollegiate Chess Championships, the round immediately after the round 2 game that I've already shared on my YouTube channel and on my blog against Webster C's Board 4. And I thought that this game kind of provided a nice example of how to play against someone lower rated using their own weaknesses against them. And what do I mean by their own weaknesses against them? Well, we were playing Texas Tech B or C. I'm not exactly sure if I remember, but I was playing some guy who was unrated, but I didn't want to take him for granted. And based on how he played, I'd say up to a certain point he played like a 1600 rated player. But I kind of knew that if I just emphasized points of the game that maybe were less comfortable to him, I could probably get a slightly advantageous position with black. And so the theme that I want to really talk about in this video is really contesting the center and using tension with pawn structures to really make your opponent uncomfortable. Generally, low-rated players, and by low-rated players, I mean players rated under like 1900, they generally feel a little bit less comfortable when they always have to calculate when pawns are attacking each other but no one wants to take. And sometimes they're so uncomfortable that they're willing to concede the tension and capture the pawn even if it's advantageous to the other side. And usually, in most cases, when you have central pawns and they're attacking each other and you're the one to take, with few exceptions, it's usually not the best idea to release the tension because it usually means your opponent gets to improve their structure or they get to develop a piece. I mean, that's why they put the pawn on that square in the first place. So in this game, my opponent had like a slow developing plan, and I was able to use what I know about creating central tension to really help me be able to make decisions while not really using that much time on the clock. So let's go ahead and go through the game and show you what I mean. So my opponent's white, and he started out with d4, and when he played e3, he had already spent a fair bit of time, which meant that perhaps he wasn't as familiar with the King's Indian setups, but I didn't want to take anything for granted. Alexander Onishuk, who's a GM, is the coach of the Texas Tech team, and I'm sure, at some point, my opponent had worked with him and other GMs on that team, so, I didn't want to take my opponent for granted. My opponent, he'd only played one game before this, so for me, this just meant that this was a longer-term game. So I played d6. As you guys know, I'm a King's Indian player. Bishop d3, castles, castles. And here I kind of have to make my first decision, which is, do I want to play for e5 or do I want to play for c5? And I think that there's no right answer to this, but I feel like for this situation, there's a better answer. And if you guys have a chesslecture.com account, you might have seen Brian Smith's video on a tempo up Benoni, where he played c5 in a position like this, and at some point White had to play e3 to e4, where he gave up an extra tempo, and it was a slightly dynamic game, and there was some calculation involved, but for the most part, Black was able to get enough initiative out of White making an extra move. In this game, I could play c5, and probably tactically, I'd be better than my opponent, but I really wanted to be able to make my opponent feel a little bit uncomfortable. My opponent's already played e3 because he's protecting the d4 pawn, and that already kind of tells me something, because in the King's Indian, one of the main targets is the d4 square or the d4 pawn. So when my opponent plays e3, he's really concerned about how the d4 pawn stands. So a move like e5 does a better job of contesting the d4 square, but it also, at some point, if my opponent's not really doing anything, maybe I can push for e4 and get a reverse King's Indian attack. So I decided to go for a reverse King's Indian attack setup. So I played knight bd7. My opponent is just slowly developing, knight c3, e5, and now my opponent made a move that I hadn't really seen before, b3. Okay, well, I don't want to judge my opponent. I think the bishop on d3 is a little bit misplaced. I think it should be on e2. But, I had seen, similar pawn structures to this. I know Grandmaster Ilya Nizhnik likes to play a lot of structures like this, and, he does relatively well. I mean, he's a 2700 GM. So, this is a solid structure. White hasn't really conceded anything. It's just a matter of, is White still playing for an initiative? So, in the spirit of the King's Indian attack, you're supposed to want to play for e4. I mean, that's what Bobby Fischer did in all of his games. So, for me, my thought was, well, if I can, try to create that same idea of like a King's Indian versus a French, but reverse colors, well, then I should probably be playing for e4. So I decided to continue pushing my central tension, which is this move, rook to e8. And now, because of my central tension, my opponent always has to calculate e takes d4, which I'm probably not going to do. e4, and if he's too uncomfortable with the position, he can play d takes e5. If he plays a move like e4, well, he's just wasted a tempo, but at the same time, he's blocking his bishop on d3, and now all of his pawns are on light squared, so he has a bad Maroczy bind. Now, my opponent, looking for moves, didn't really know how to deal with this threat of e5 to e4, and instead of trying to deal with it, maybe a move like queen c2 or something, he took the most drastic measures because the tension in the center really pushed his ability to calculate the position. And this is what I mean by trying to emphasize the points where your opponents are weakest. Try to put them in positions where they're uncomfortable, but at the same time, you're not taking any risks. You see, if I played c5, there are points where I could mess up as black and, maybe white can get a good game. But here with e5, I'm not playing anything particularly dangerous, but my opponent has to consider all of these lines over and over and over again. And at some point, they're going to make a mistake. So my opponent, not really knowing what to do, spent about 10 minutes on this move and decided he wanted to relieve the tension. D takes e5, d takes e5. Well, I'm threatening the fork on e4. I have a good King's Indian. My opponent plays e4. So he stopped the fork, but at what cost? Well, if you look at the center, I control the d4 square, he controls the d5 square, but once I play this move c6, I'm the only one with control over a legitimate central outpost in this game. And it's now a matter of maneuvering and getting your pieces onto better squares, but black is going to find that he's really cramped. His bishop on d3 really can't do that much. The whole point of queenside fianchettoing doesn't really make sense anymore because the bishop on c1 doesn't really want to go to b2. My bishop on g7 is a little bit awkward and a little bit uncomfortable, but once I move my knight away from f6 and try to get a knight onto d4, well, then I can actually, try to play e takes d4 and have a passed pawn, and my bishop does a good job of protecting that pawn. So I have a very solid position. It's really hard to find weaknesses in black's position. So my opponent continued with a normal developing idea, bishop to e3. Well, I don't want to have my queen on the same file as his queen because I'd rather have the queens on the board right now. So I played queen to c7, and my opponent, kind of realizing that he can't play for the d5 square, decided that he wanted to attack the c6 pawn. He played the move b4, and his idea is b5 and then hope that I play c takes b5. And this is a kind of linear thinking that I see a lot, especially with some of my students who are about 1500, where the idea is like, I'll march my pawn all the way down, and I expect that you're going to take my pawn. So when he plays b5, he expects I'll play c takes b5, allowing either knight takes b5 or c takes b5 followed by knight to d5 ideas. So this kind of thinking is incorrect because I don't actually have to take, and in fact, white's wasting tempi playing b3 to b4, b4 to b5, and then b5 takes c6 because I'm going to play b takes c6, and I'm still controlling the same squares. Yes, I have now two isolated pawns, but my opponent also has done the same to himself. His bishop on d3 isn't any better, and at the same time, I get to make more moves to improve my position. So at this point, I need to find a place for my d7 knight because now it's a little bit misplaced. So I decided I'm going to move to the f8 square for two reasons. One, I want to create an open lane for my bishop. So my bishop's going to go to g4, and I'm going to trade it for this knight on f3. And the reason that I want to trade my bishop for the knight is that I want to reduce the number of defenders of the d4 square. So if I can get rid of my light squared bishop, which can't attack d4, for a piece that can attack d4, then I'm making progress. The other idea behind knight to f8 is my knight's going to go to e6. When my knight goes to e6, I'll be able to play knight to d4 and use my central outpost. So my opponent doesn't have a really effective way to stop this. I mean, if he's smart, he'll play the move h3 to stop bishop to g4, but I can still play knight to e6, and I'm in no rush to really try to develop my bishop. I can just play like a rook d8 at some point, and then knight d4, and then put my bishop on e6, and I'm doing totally fine. My opponent played rook to c1, bishop to g4, b5. Well, he's not really making progress, and at this point in the game, I realized, okay, I want to continue my plan, and I did have to consider one idea, which was after when I played the move knight to e6, this idea of knight to d5. It's a very common hedgehog idea, because if I take, well, then my opponent is actually making a lot of progress, and I could even be worse here. So this was something I wanted to avoid, but when I started looking at this position, I realized, oh, well, queen d8, and all my problems are solved. If he plays knight takes f6, I can play bishop takes f6, or queen takes f6, putting pressure on f3. And I still have full control over this d4 outpost, and it's not quite clear what my opponent's done to really improve the position. So this was something I was relatively comfortable with, and my opponent didn't go for knight d5. I mean, that's kind of like an advanced priom or principle against a hedgehog, and I only know that because I've played against a hedgehog before, and I wasn't surprised that my opponent didn't play it. Instead, he played the more natural h3, which kicks the bishop. So I traded. That was my goal all along. Queen takes f3, and now because my opponent doesn't have enough defenders of the d4 square, I just went ahead and claimed my outpost. I'm okay if black takes my knight on d4 because then I get a protected passed pawn after e takes d4 and c4, and it's going to be really hard for my opponent to really get targets. So my opponent took. Notice again, there's this kind of quasi tension in the center. If my opponent doesn't do anything with my knight is kind of annoying, and it's really hard to play around it. So my opponent's willing to make bigger positional concessions to avoid tactical problems. And this is something that I've noticed a lot with working with younger players. So bishop takes d4, e takes d4. I've just made a forcing move, and now I have a protected passed pawn. This position still technically isn't so easy, but I can put my bishop on h6, I can put my knight on h5 at some point, and I can start putting pressure against the e4 pawn. So my opponent decided to take drastic measures here. He played the move knight to f4, which allowed for the move bishop to h6. And I feel like at this point, players who are under 1400 would instinctively play this move g3, again to avoid tactical problems, for the sake of positional concessions. But after bishop takes, pawn takes, knight goes here, well, my opponent's already struggling, and after a move like e5, I can just play f6. But my opponent has problems here. If he tries to play f5, I can just play like queen to f4, and obviously the trade is good for me because this bishop is, not really doing anything. The pawn on h3 isn't even the biggest reason why I'm going to be better. It's just this bishop has nowhere to go. I'm threatening knight to e2 check. My opponent can forget about it. So this was the structural idea that I was looking at. But my opponent, tactically, it's not the best. But I think he makes the hardest but most practical decision, which is to just go ahead and give up the exchange. And there is some strategy involved here, because after I take his knight, he recaptures, putting pressure on the c pawn. I get his rook. Well, there really aren't that many open files on the board, so most of the work actually isn't done. And if you look around the board, well, I do have to be careful about my opponent starting to push his e and d pawns. If I let that happen too much, well then, it almost might be justified to sacrifice. So I have to come up with a plan, and I want to kind of use a structural defect, which is I have two passed pawns that are protected, but I would rather have more open files. And this is, I think, one of the rare times that I think that that's important. So my goal is I want to play c4, sacrifice this pawn so I can win the e4 pawn. So I'm going to play rook on a to c8 with the idea of moving my queen over at the right time to play c4. My opponent plays queen g4. I just attacked it once with h5, queen to g5, and I play queen to d6 with the threat of c4. And this is a kind of hard idea to see because we're always told that you always want to keep your passed pawns. They're really important, but there's really no other way for black to make progress. If I don't open up the e file, it's going to be really hard for my rooks to really become active. And one thing that I've always been told since I was a kid was that rooks are claustrophobic and that rooks are bad bishops. And my opponent does have a bishop here. His bishop isn't that great, but if the position opens up, my rooks are going to be much better than his bishop. Right now, my bishop can do a lot more maneuvering than my rooks can. So my opponent, not really knowing that I was going to play c4, opted for f4, trying to get some attack, trying to get some counterplay. I played c4, and my opponent made a move here that suggested that he was going to make a sacrifice, but then didn't really follow through on it, and it cost him the game because of a simple tactical oversight. But I was pretty much looking at just taking c4 lines and then taking on e4, and the game's kind of over. So my opponent kind of made another tough but practical decision, which was to play e5, but didn't really follow it through. I think here his best chances are taking g6. Queen takes g6, and I saw all of this during the game. But the problem for black, not the problem for black, the problem for white is that even though he has all of these pawns, if we do a quick pawn count, I have 4 pawns, he has 6 pawns, I still have 2 rooks, I can put my rook onto d8, and I can just start penetrating. I'm going to have more activity. It's clear that black is better, but I still think that black has a lot of work to do. If I'm not careful, e6 check can be annoying in some lines. So at least he's getting some counterplay. My opponent, spent a long time on this move, and I really thought the more he was thinking about it, the more he would play bishop takes g6, but I guess at some point he realized he didn't want to do that. He wanted to have his queen on a better square, but of course by doing that he missed the threat that I had all along, which was after queen to f6, I just took his bishop and I kind of cleaned house. So, my opponent, up until this point before he hung the bishop, I think played like a 1600 rated player. And I think that this game really shows, for those amateurs out there, how to really exploit the weaknesses of players who aren't quite expert level yet, which is to really force your opponents to consider whether they'd rather be tactically worse or positionally worse. And in this game, even though there was a lot of work left to be done, I really was able to put the grinds on my opponent when I played this move rook to e8. And this is the defining moment because now my opponent has to consider all of these, central tension ideas. And, in a moment of either frustration or lack of clarity as to how to continue playing the position, he opened up the position and made my life easier positionally. Now, granted, there was a lot of work to be done, but you guys could see, black's play was very fluid, whereas white couldn't really find that much. He had a bad bishop, and his rooks were never really able to make it to the d file. And so it's really hard for, some of these younger players or weaker players to see that, sometimes it's more important to, keep tension in the board, even if it means they have to calculate more, because in positions like this, they just lack the counterplay that they need. And so when you guys are playing your games against players who are anywhere, under 1900, I really think you guys should be considering, how can I really, force my opponent to be uncomfortable by creating central tension where it doesn't hurt me if they take, but at the same time, if they don't take, I'm still totally fine. The opening setup that I adopted here, it wasn't really anything special. I mean, this is just like a basic knight bd7 King's Indian or reverse King's Indian attack against the French, and my opponent just didn't know what to do. But I mean, I didn't make any concessions to get to this position, whereas if I had gone for in this position to play c5, maybe I might have made some concessions because it's a Benoni. It's going to be more tactical. So sometimes it's not always what's more flashy that wins. It's what's more practical and what really puts the grind on your opponent. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. I won't be coming out with an article or a video on Sunday because I'll be in Boston for my tournament. But next week I'll come out with 2 videos either on my games from the Boston Chess Congress or from maybe Grandmaster games that are happening around the world. Until then, this is Candidate Master Isaac Steincamp signing off. I hope you have a good weekend.